What if the country you thought you knew never actually existed? Not in the way you imagined it, not under the name you learned in school, not with the borders history drew for it, not with the identity the world assigned to it across 2,500 years of uninterrupted civilization. What if the name that defined an entire empire, a name that gave the world its poetry, its architecture, its first concept of human rights, was never the name its people used for themselves? And what if, one morning in 1935, a single diplomatic letter erased that name from every official document on Earth, and the people who mourned it most were the very people it had never truly belonged to? This is not a story about geography. It is not a story about politics. It is the story of how a civilization survives by constantly translating itself, changing its vocabulary while protecting something wordless and ancient underneath. It is the story of how empires are named, renamed, conquered, absorbed, and reborn, and it is the story of a question that has no clean answer. When a people changes its name, does it change itself? Or does it simply reveal how little names were ever in control? That question is why we're here, and if you're the kind of person who has ever felt that official history is always one layer above the real story, subscribe to this channel, because we dig beneath the dates and the dynasties to find what actually happened to the people living inside them. Chapter 1. Before the name. There is a plateau at the center of the ancient world, not the most fertile land, not the easiest to defend, but vast, ringed by mountains in the north, sliding toward desert in the east, opening toward the sea in the south. And on this plateau, somewhere around the first millennium before the Common Era, a collection of Iranian-speaking tribes began to separate into distinct peoples. Two of them would shape everything that followed: the Medes, who settled in the northwest and built the first great power of the plateau, and the Persians, the Parsa, who settled in the southwest, in a region they called Parsa, which the Greeks would one day hear and render as Persis, and eventually Persia. Think about that for a moment. The name the entire world would use for thousands of years, the name attached to one of the greatest empires in human history, was never the name these people called themselves or their land. The Persians called their homeland Parsa. They called their people Parsa. They called their civilization, in their own ancient tongue, Aryanam, land of the Aryans, which was not yet a word corrupted by the 20th century, but simply a descriptor of a linguistic and cultural family stretching from the Iranian plateau to the Indian subcontinent. The word Iran is a direct descendant of that ancient word. Aryanam became Iran, became Iran. The name that the world would come to see as new, as modern, as the replacement for something ancient, which was in fact older than Persia by centuries. History contains no shortage of ironies, but this one is worth sitting with. The ancient name was Iran. The foreign name, the Greek transliteration, the European export, was Persia. And for 2,500 years, the world would use the foreigner's word, and the people themselves would watch it become more famous than their own. Chapter 2. The First Superpower. In 559 BCE, a king named Cyrus became ruler of the Persian tribe. Within 20 years, he had conquered the Medes. Within 30, he had absorbed Lydia in what is now Western Turkey. Within 40, he had taken Babylon, the greatest city on earth, without a battle, entering its gates while its last king fled. The historian Lloyd Llewellyn Jones calls the empire Cyrus built, without hesitation, the world's first superpower. But here's what's fascinating. The Achaemenid Empire, named for the dynasty Cyrus founded, was not simply vast. Empires had been vast before. What made it philosophically extraordinary was how it chose to govern. The Greek chronicler Herodotus, who distrusted Persians on principle and still could not hide his astonishment at what they built, described an empire that stretched from the banks of the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea, 500,000 square miles, dozens of peoples, languages, religions, traditions. And yet Cyrus did not demand conformity. He issued what historians now call the Cyrus Cylinder, a proclamation written in Babylonian, declaring that conquered peoples could worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and maintain their own customs under Persian rule. This was not mercy. It was political theology. Cyrus understood something that most conquerors never learn, that an empire which respects what it absorbs grows stronger than one that erases it. The Jews, exiled in Babylon, were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The Egyptians were ruled by Persian kings who dressed as Egyptian pharaohs and made offerings to Egyptian gods. The Babylonians saw their religious institutions preserved, not dismantled. Under Darius, who came to power in 522 BCE after a brief succession crisis, the empire was organized into 20 satrapies, provinces with appointed governors who sent tribute to the center but maintained local customs. Darius built Persepolis, a ceremonial capital so extraordinary that even its ruins, burned by Alexander 2 centuries later, communicate a sense of civilizational confidence that is difficult to put into words. And yet this model was fragile. Its genius, absorbing rather than erasing, meant that the empire was always partially something other than itself. It contained its own transformation within its structure. And when the collision came, when the force from the west arrived that would shatter Persepolis and scatter the Achaemenid royal line, the empire's greatest strength became its most vulnerable point. Chapter 3. The man who became what he conquered. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont with roughly 40,000 soldiers and began to dismantle the Persian Empire piece by piece. Within 6 years, Alexander had done what no Greek city-state had ever managed. He had ended the Achaemenid dynasty, burned its ceremonial heart, and declared himself the ruler of everything from Macedonia to the edge of India. This is the chapter where historians usually tell the story of conquest. The battles, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, are extraordinary, but they are not the real story. The real story is what Alexander did after he won. He wore Persian robes. He adopted Persian court ceremonials. He married a Bactrian princess named Roxana and encouraged his generals to take Persian wives. He retained Persian administrators in their positions. He learned the Persian language. He burned Persepolis, possibly in a moment of drunken theater, possibly as a calculated political statement, and then spent the rest of his short life trying to become what he had destroyed. This was an identity crisis of civilizational proportions, not just for Alexander, but for Persia itself. Because what the conquest revealed was something the Achaemenids' own model had made inevitable. When your empire is built on cultural absorption, you're always only one generation from being absorbed yourself. The Persian elite did not simply disappear, they adapted. Persian administrators managed the empire under Greek-speaking rulers. Persian customs survived in the court culture of Alexander's successors, the Seleucids. The Persian language, Old Persian giving way to Middle Persian, continued as the living tongue of millions. And something else survived, harder to name, a sense of civilizational continuity, a memory of what the plateau had once been, carried not in temples or armies, but in language, in poetry, in the stubborn particularity of a people who had learned, under Cyrus, how to survive by absorbing what came at them. Chapter 4. The Art of Surviving Everything. Now this is where it gets complicated. For 500 years after Alexander, the Iranian plateau passed through several hands, Seleucid, then Parthian, then Sassanid. Each transition brought a new dynasty, a new official ideology, a new relationship between the rulers and the deep cultural memory of the plateau. The Parthians, who drove out the Seleucids in the 2nd century BCE, were themselves of Iranian stock, and they deliberately cultivated a connection to the Achaemenid legacy, positioning themselves as restorers rather than conquerors. The Sassanids, who overthrew the Parthians in 224 CE, went further. They built an empire that would last over 400 years. They called it the Iran-Shah, the Empire of Iran. They invested in Zoroastrianism as a state religion. They built bureaucracies, sponsored poets, and maintained a court culture of extraordinary sophistication. At its height, the Sassanid Empire was the equal of Rome in every measurable dimension, in military power, in administrative complexity, in artistic production, in sheer civilizational weight. And then, between 633 and 651 CE, the Arab armies of the early Islamic Caliphate destroyed it. This is the chapter that most narratives treat as an ending. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, fled across the plateau as his armies collapsed and was murdered. By a miller, according to some sources, an almost unbearably deflating end for a line of kings who had traced their ancestry to the divine in 651 CE. But here is what actually happened next. The Iranian plateau converted to Islam. Slowly, incompletely, over several generations, the majority of its people adopted the new faith, and then, and this is the survival mechanism that defines Iranian civilization, they did not dissolve into Arab culture, they translated themselves. Persian scholars became the backbone of early Islamic intellectual life. Persian administrators ran the Abbasid Caliphate from Baghdad. The Persian language, now written in the Arabic script but unmistakably Persian, became the language of poetry, philosophy, and mysticism across the Islamic world. Rumi wrote in Persian. Avicenna thought in Persian. Ferdowsi, in the 10th century, composed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a 60,000 couplet epic that re-narrated the entire pre-Islamic history of Iran in exquisite Persian verse, deliberately and defiantly preserving the memory of Cyrus and Darius and the Sassanid kings within the body of a new culture that might otherwise have erased them. Civilizations do not die. They translate themselves across time, changing vocabulary while preserving something essential. And nothing in Iranian history demonstrates this more clearly than what happened between 651 and the arrival of the Safavids, nearly 900 years of survival by adaptation, 900 years of remaining Persian without the political structures that had once made Persia legible to the world. Chapter 5. The Masterstroke of the Safavids. In 1501 CE, a teenage king named Ismail rode into Tabriz at the head of an army of Turkic-speaking warriors called the Kizilbash, the Red Heads, named for their distinctive crimson headgear, and declared himself Shah of Iran. He was 14 years old. He would transform the plateau in ways that still define it today. The decision Ismail made in the first months of his reign was not military, it was theological. He declared that the official religion of his new Safavid state would be Twelver Shi'a Islam, the branch of Islam followed by perhaps 10% of Muslims at the time, and almost none of the population of the Iranian plateau, which had been predominantly Sunni for centuries. This was not a religious conversion in the conventional sense. It was a geopolitical masterstroke disguised as a spiritual declaration. The Ottoman Empire to the west was Sunni. The Uzbek powers to the east were Sunni. By making Shi'a Islam the state religion, Ismail was simultaneously creating a distinct civilizational identity that separated Iran from its neighbors and building a wall of theological difference that would make his subjects difficult to absorb into rival empires. And yet, and this is the depth beneath the politics, it worked as more than strategy. Over the next century and a half, the Safavids built a genuinely Shia Iranian culture, architecture, ritual, pilgrimage routes, a calendar of sacred observances that merged the pre-Islamic Persian festival of Nowruz with the Shia calendar of martyrdom and remembrance. The duality crystallized here, a civilization that was simultaneously Islamic and Iranian, Arab in its sacred language, and Persian in its soul. For the first time in centuries, the plateau had a political center that called itself Iran, used the Persian language as its official tongue, and maintained a cultural identity distinct from both the Arab world and the Turkic world. The Safavids lasted until 1722. What they built lasted considerably longer. Haprana, Chapter 6. The letter that changed everything. In March of 1935, the Iranian government of Reza Shah Pahlavi sent a circular letter to every foreign embassy in the world. The letter contained a single administrative request. Please stop using the name Persia to refer to our country. The correct name, the name we have always called ourselves, is Iran. The world complied. Maps were updated. Encyclopedia entries were revised. The word Persia migrated from the present tense to the past, and something extraordinary happened in its wake. People began to mourn a name that had never truly belonged to them. The irony is almost too precise to be historical. It feels like something a novelist would construct and then think better of. The name Persia was always a Greek word, a foreigner's rendering of a provincial name, applied to an entire civilization by people who observed it from the outside. The Persians had never called themselves Persians. Their poets, their kings, their diplomats writing in their own language had always said Iran, always said Iran, always traced their identity back to that ancient word the Greeks had never quite caught. And yet by 1935, Persia had accumulated 2,500 years of Western cultural weight. It was the land of Cyrus and Darius in European memory. It was the setting of Herodotus, of the Arabian Nights in Western imagination, of the carpets and miniatures and turquoise tiles that had made their way into European collections across centuries of trade. The name Persia was saturated with a kind of romantic grandeur that Iran, precise, ancient, correct, simply did not carry in foreign ears. Reza Shah's motivations were partly nationalist, partly modernizing, and partly connected to a pan-Iranian ideology that emphasized the Aryan heritage of the Iranian people in terms that were uncomfortably contemporary with the rise of similar rhetoric in Europe. The timing was not incidental. 1935 was 2 years after Hitler's rise to power. The word Aryan was being claimed, distorted, weaponized, and Iran, land of the Aryans in the literal linguistic sense, chose precisely this moment to assert that name. History rarely delivers its ironies neatly. This one arrived with the precision of a surgical instrument. What the 1935 name change did not do, what no administrative circular could do, was alter the civilization underneath. The poetry remained, the language remained, the Nowruz celebration remained. The architecture, the philosophical tradition, the particular quality of light that Persian miniaturists had spent centuries learning to render, all of it remained, indifferent to what the embassy in London was now required to write on its letterhead. And then 1979 arrived, the Islamic Revolution, and now both names became contested in new ways. Persia became the word of the diaspora, the exiles, the monarchy's mourners, those who wanted to signal continuity with something before the revolution. Iran became simultaneously the correct historical term and, in Western discourse, the name of a government rather than a civilization. The names split the identity again, and the split has not healed. What the names were always hiding. We began with a paradox, a country that changed its name and lost something in the process, even though the new name was the older one. And now, having walked through 4,000 years of transformation, we can see the paradox more clearly than we could at the start. Names do not contain civilizations. They label them, imperfectly, provisionally, from the outside or the inside, depending on who holds the pen. What Cyrus built did not need a name to survive Alexander. What the Sassanids preserved did not need a dynasty to outlast the Arab conquest. What Ferdowsi wrote did not need a state to carry it across a millennium. The civilization survived because something in it understood, almost instinctively, how to absorb what came at it without dissolving into it. Persia is gone. Iran is here. And underneath both names, something that is neither Persia nor Iran continues, the particular human project of a people who have spent 3,000 years learning how to remain themselves while becoming something the world can no longer quite name. That is not a tragedy. It is the deepest kind of survival there is. Do you think Iran should ever reclaim the name Persia? Or has Iran earned its own ancient dignity, older than the Greek word the world spent 2 millennia mispronouncing? Drop your answer in the comments. The conversation underneath this video is always worth more than the video itself.